Welcome to part 3 of me building a slab table with absolutely no clue what I am doing. Today I tried to salvage a horrible first epoxy pour, get some really nice legs, and things finally seem to start going my way. Let's delve. At the end of part 2, I stayed up all night battling epoxy that was leaking all over the place in my mediocre mold that I made. With all the spillage that occurred, the epoxy ended up about a quarter inch below the top of the slab. So, I mixed up some clear epoxy to fill this void. The clear epoxy also gives some depth to this piece, which I think is quite nice. Hopefully it doesn't turn yellow over time. What you are seeing here is some disaster relief. This side was the main source of leakage, which makes sense because there was no wall to hold the epoxy back. During the crisis, I used whatever I could get my hands on to try to stop it. And then once all the epoxy cured, I was left with a big mess of things essentially glued to each other. This was an extremely unpleasant task, but with the help of someone who is not shown in the video, I eventually got the edge all cleaned up, and I could turn to taking the table out of the mold. This process was actually a lot easier than I expected. I just used a bunch of wooden wedges to separate the slab from the melamine, and it actually was kind of fun. Getting the slab detached from the bottom piece was also way easier than I expected, and I attribute this to all of the various chemicals I smeared all over the place before starting the epoxy nightmare. You can see in some places that the melamine sort of broke off when I took it off, leaving some of it still attached to the table. This is no big deal. I can always trim that up later. We're free. So we say. With the slab detached from the form, I could begin the final flattening process. During the few days I spent flattening the slab, a very ominous thing occurred. Blacktail Studio, the king of slab tables himself, released a video where a 3-table build for a client ended up getting ruined due to trapped moisture in the slabs. Because rather than actually checking the moisture content of the slabs himself, he just assumed that they were dry, because that is what he was led to believe by those who sold him the slab. This hit a little close to home for me, because even though you only see one table, I actually am building 3 tables at the same time. And just like him, I just assumed that what I was told was accurate and didn't double check it. Some people might tell me that I am a bit foolish for this, and I agree. With a feeling of dread, I went to check the moisture content of my slabs, and it seemed to be just fine. This was a major relief. And even if it was slightly unstable, there would be no point in stopping now. The worst thing that I could envision happening is that the finish on the tables begins to be compromised in a few years, and in this case I would just have to chalk this one up for a loss and build a new one for free. One thing to note here is how much epoxy is on the underside of the slab from all the various battles I had in the last video, but you already saw me flatten a slab, so no need to get back into that. Desiderius Erasmus once said, "Prevention is better than cure." And that is the whole point of this box here. It contains C-channels, which are attached to the underside of the table for the purpose of increasing the rigidity of the table and holding it flat as time wears on. I purchased metal table legs from Flowy Line Design, and I have to say, this was one of the longest unboxing experiences I have ever encountered. I cut open the first box only to find 2 smaller boxes inside that box. And once I got those open, the legs were wrapped in miles and miles of stretch wrap. They were undamaged though, so I guess the packaging served a purpose. It was like that annoying gift-giving prank that no one likes, where you start out with a box the size of a refrigerator, but continue to unbox smaller and smaller boxes until you end up with a pair of socks, or maybe a gift card to a restaurant you'll never go to if you're really lucky. E.B. White, who died on October 1st, 1985, said, "One of the most time-consuming things is to have an enemy." And while that may be true, the one thing that is undoubtedly more time-consuming than that is sanding. Here I am just sanding out the little lines left over from the slab flattening, but I can already tell that the final sanding is going to take longer than it takes for me to get out of bed every morning. Here I am spraying down the surface of the table with water. And to be completely honest, I don't exactly remember why I did this, but it was the first time I got to see a preview of how the table would look with finish on it. After that, I trimmed up the sides and started work on the placement of the table legs and C-channels. Figuring out where to put the legs was a bit of a goofy time for sure. Because I am the only one working on this, there was no way to stage the table to see how it looks right side up. So the first time the legs would be attached and the table would be right side up was actually going to be when I deliver the table. So for this reason, I decided to set it up so that the legs could be attached in two different places. And that way, if it was decided that the legs should be further apart or closer together, it would be as easy as unscrewing a few bolts and attaching them elsewhere. For some reason, I failed to film me working on attaching the legs, so here's me installing the C-channels, which is basically the same as installing the legs. I cut out a groove for it to rest in with my router, and then installed some threaded inserts to connect the bolts to. Speaking of threaded inserts, that was a very confusing aspect of this project. I'll dive into that in just a second, but first, enjoy this. I ordered the threaded inserts and bolts that go in them from Concept 13, which is a wood supplier somewhere in the vast land of Canada. Like the silly man that I am, I decided to put the name Maybe Trotters on the shipping address. This is a key detail to remember for later in the story. The package was getting shipped to my brother's house, and after ordering it, I kind of forgot about it for almost 2 weeks. When I thought to check the tracking, it said that the package had been delivered to an AutoZone about an hour from where I lived. Confused, I got on the phone with UPS customer service, whose call center is somewhere across the sea. Trying to track the package addressed to a Maybe Trotters was very confusing, but they ended up confirming that it was at the AutoZone. I have no idea why it was there, and that wasn't the only place it had been. It had been delivered and then picked up again from the house I had lived in between the age of 5 and 10. I drove to the AutoZone only to make a complete fool of myself asking for a package for Maybe Trotters, and then to be told there was no package for someone who might be Trotters. 2 hours of fighting with customer service on the phone again, and I figured out that it was on its way back to the sender. So I ended up driving another hour just to intercept the shipment before it went back. Luckily, I didn't need to show ID for Maybe Trotters, and the office just gave it to me when I provided the tracking information. And now I will abruptly cut off the build here until next week. In the next video, you will see me apply a tabletop finish, pack up and install the table by myself, and deliver and install it with the help of my dear brother. Thanks for watching, and until next time, go slide down the steps.